basically I help people either cross the Canada-US border either way. One way it's extremely easy, the other way it's extremely hard. And I bring international artists from overseas into North America. So Matthew and I overlap a bit. I take care of visas and waivers, withholding waivers. I take people through the whole cycle of finally doing their taxes at the end of the cycle so that they can then get another waiver in Canada, because if you don't complete the cycle, then you do not get your next waiver, and this is something new in Canada. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit in the handout is entry into, starting with contracts, things you should be aware of if you're dealing internationally, a little bit about entry, and then we're going to talk about, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew to talk about work visas. Right. Yeah, work visas. And so let's try that. Okay. So how do I get my, can I get the tech guy to get my PowerPoint back?
I don't know, it's not my computer. Eli?
It's not my computer either.
Where is Eli?
Eli? I don't know.
Eli?
What's fine. Never mind, I'm going to waste time.
Do you want to use mine for your notes? Because I've got yours up here.
Okay, yeah, sure. Cool.
I can go get it.
Okay, thanks. So we're gonna make this as quick as possible. These sessions take, when I've done them in the past, about an hour and a half with questions that people have, you know, about all the kinds of things we're talking about. So I'm going to talk about contracting in general. I deal with people from China and the language, people from Russia. The language is always an issue because I'm not Russian or Chinese speaking. So you have to know what's in a contract. Make sure you know the language in English. I asked a friend to, because I was getting emails in Mandarin from China and needed to respond to them. She said, Google Translate. Google Translate really works. It's amazing. Yeah, I was fluent in Mandarin through Google Translate. So I use that and make note of cultural differences. I have a godson who's from Jamaica. He and I don't ever agree on time. I'll say, I'll meet you in Toronto at 2 p.m. He'll show up at 4. I say, well, 2, 4, what's the diff, you know? And so basically there's some cultural difference you have to think about. Make sure when you are contracting and involved in that whole process, you need time. Time is of the essence here because now we have, what did we say, Matthew, 8-week delay in Vermont? At least 8 weeks delay in processing visas at the Vermont Service Center. If you don't allow for that time, then you narrow your options, and Matthew will talk about that in a few minutes. Watch about currency. Our dollar sucks. American dollar is very strong. You have to know when you're going to get paid and in what currency. I had an artist who, at the time of the contract, things looked great. The dollars were at par. By the time the payment came, the dollar was 30% less. They lost that money. They lost that money because they hadn't either specified in the contract that the money must be at par, no matter what, or what currency it's going to be in, whichever, you know, is the strongest for you. So you need to think about that. Things about travel costs, who's going to pay that. Make sure you know what extras are involved in your contract. Some people do not like to do meet and greet. Some people don't. Artists, especially from Europe, this is a strange concept to them. They don't want to meet your audience. They just want to perform. And so that should be specified in your contract. Watch about force majeure. Force majeure is a term that applies to only certain things. Just because you don't feel like doing the concert is not a force majeure. I had a violinist who tried to rely on force majeure for a concert in the Far East when her mother died. Her mother died the day before she was to leave for that concert. She said to them, I'm unable to do this as force majeure, it's something beyond my control. And they said, nope, it's not. And they sued her and won. Because the death of a parent is not force majeure. It can be written in the contract. I had a group from Atlanta, Georgia, who always wrote a significant event, personal event, which might prevent them from doing their concert was written into the contract. So they had covered that, covered their bases. People should know about withholding. There's 15% withholding in Canada, there's 30% withholding in the United States. I've had artists come from India and they're suddenly shocked when there's 30% taken off their fee. And it's like, well, didn't you know? No, I didn't know I needed that money to get home. Well, you're out of luck, because unless it's covered, that withholding part of Performing North America has to be covered somehow. Thank you. Then jurisdiction of your contract, I always tested presenters when I was an agent. I'd always say, okay, the agent is going to be performing at your venue in whatever, Buffalo, New York. But if there's any problem with the contract, the jurisdiction will be Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Which means that if you have any legal things, you're going to come across the border and have to fight it in my court. And an astute presenter would always stroke that out and say, no, it's going to be where my venue is. So be aware of that. Okay, thanks. Wow, look at that. That was brilliant, because I'm just...
technical team.
There you go, Eli, thank you. So I'm going to skip, unless I need to, because I want to give enough time, and also I can take questions. I'm sure we can both take questions at any time, and feel free to kick in here at any point. For entry into Canada, let me go through it quickly and briefly. Usually people coming into, Americans are surprised at the ease with which you can come into Canada, because they want to know if they need special papers, what do they need to have with them. And so here we go. I'm just skipping through this, so I'll talk about this later. So you have this chart at the back of your handout. And this chart tells us about there are usual restrictions about crossing a border. You know, you can't, and I know this will affect many of you. If you've got $10,000 in your pocket, then it's going to be a problem crossing the border, because you can't take that much money with you in cash. If you, the main one that I've run into lately is if you have a DUI and you try to cross a border, there's a problem. Given certain circumstances for your DUI, driving under the influence, you've been pulled over for with a high alcohol blood content. And but basically, if you're coming into Canada, you need, if you're from certain countries, you do need a visitor visa. If you're visa exempt, then you just need to come to the border. Sometimes it's good to have a letter of invitation or your contract with you. You can bring your instruments across if you deal with either an inventory or a carnet. You can perform in Canada unless you're dealing with children, which brings in health and welfare regulations. But usually you don't even need a work permit now. They've changed those regulations so that most artists don't need a work permit to come into Canada. So getting into Canada is extremely easy. Tough crowd, am I doing okay here? Yeah, thanks. So basically, at the border, I coach people in crossing the border, because people do the silliest things. They'll start telling their life story to a border guard who couldn't care less. When they ask you a question, answer it succinctly. Where are you going? Detroit. That's it. Don't say anything more, because he doesn't care. He scans your passport. He sees if there's anything he has to be concerned about. He may ask you a trick question. Do you have any oranges? You know, but basically you have to think, oh, I'm just going to tell him what he wants to know, and we're all going to have a good time, and I'm going to get across the border. I had an artist from Montreal, surprisingly, try to get into New York. And he came to the border. His skin happened to be a little swarthy, but he was totally French-Canadian. He was born and bred. And the border official got a little suspicious, took his cell phone and started looking at all of the pictures on it, looking for child pornography. Looked at his schedule to make sure that what he said he was going to be doing in the United States, he was going to be doing. And it was a very traumatic experience for him. But you know, you have to think, okay, you can run into any kind of situation crossing the border. And no matter what, it's that person at the border who lets you in or out. I mean, or denies you entry. That person has the supreme authority. Had a fellow agent from British Columbia. his artist was showcasing at WA, Western Arts Alliance, and he came up to the border, and he had an attitude with the U.S. border guard. He's like, yeah, you know, I'm an important agent here in Canada, and you know, my artist is showcasing at Western Arts Alliance. Well, the guy doesn't know what that is and doesn't care, and he just irritated that border crossing guy so much that he stamped his passport, denied entry for 2 years. And the guy was just like, you know, I felt sorry for him, but you know what? When you're at a border, that's a time to be humble, ex-Canadian, like, you know, yeah, right, everything's good. You know, it's not the time to tell a joke. Don't make any reference to any, you know, revolutionary event, like we burned your White House in 1812, and, you know, looking forward to doing it again if Donald Trump gets in. So anything like that. Entry into Canada is dead easy, and at the border, I just advise everybody to just be succinct, straightforward, and you get across. Okay, I think our next thing might be work visas. What do you think? Yeah,
All right.
You want to do it?
Sure. How many people here are, well, actually, is there anybody here who's concerned about getting into the U.S. who isn't a Canadian? Or isn't, like, should I be only talking about Canadians, or should we talk about other people? You almost raised your hand.
Yeah, one of the band members has a Brazilian, well, yeah.
All right, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a lot of things globally, and then I'm going to have like a little footnote saying, but it's different for Brazilians. But mostly we're going to talk about Canadians. Yeah,
And for Europeans?
yeah, I'll say Brazilians and Europeans. Canadians are a little bit special. You all know that. So oddly, they're treated a little bit better. It doesn't feel like that usually, but so I think the first question that I get asked the most these days is, do I really need a visa to perform in the US? And when you do the analysis of whether you need a visa or not, the place you start is anytime somebody is performing in the US who's not a US citizen or doesn't have a green card, you have to have a work visa. And then what you do is you look for an exception to that rule. And there's a couple of important exceptions. The most important exception to people in this audience, I think, is probably called the showcase exception. And that is a widely misunderstood exception. It doesn't have to do with whether you're getting paid or not. Not getting paid doesn't mean you don't need a visa. What the showcase exception says is if the principal purpose that the audience is in attendance at your show in the US is because they're considering hiring the artist at some point in the future, then that is classified as a bona fide industry showcase and you don't need a visa for it. The history behind that goes back to the 60s when there was a tailor from Hong Kong who came to the US to try to get orders to go and make suits back in Hong Kong. And he was arrested for working in the US illegally, challenged it, the court went up to a high court, and the court finally said, no, he wasn't working, he was soliciting work, and that's different. So when you've got a band from Toronto that goes down and plays South by Southwest, they're playing under the Hong Kong Taylor rule, which means that they're not going to perform, they're actually soliciting work. It looks a lot like performing, but they're actually soliciting work. That's why they don't need a visa. Now, to make a little bit more, because this is such an issue, I'm going to go a little bit farther into it and then we'll be done with it. But you could easily say to yourself, well, I understand why APAP certainly falls within that, because everybody at APAP is, you have to be a member of APAP, you have to be, are you familiar with APAP, the conference in New York? Okay. To go to those shows, you have to be a member of APAP, you have to be a part of the industry, therefore, obviously, that performance is the solicitation of work. But what about South by Southwest? What about CMJ? Yes, a lot of industries there, but the punters can go and buy tickets, the general public can go to those shows as well. So why does that classify under the Hong Kong Taylor rule? Well, the reason's a little weird. For many years, South by Southwest advised that all their artists, all the foreign artists, should get visas. And then they hired a very, very clever lawyer who they said, can you change this somehow? Can you fix this? So he went to the State Department and he said, is there any way that what we're doing at South by Southwest could fall into the bona fide industry showcase rule? And they said, no, obviously not. You're selling tickets to the general public. Yes, there's a showcase element to this, but also it's entertainment to a large extent. And he said, but wait, think about it like this. How could agents and labels at those shows know how the general public is going to respond to the artist if the general public isn't in the room? And oddly, the State Department said, good point. Okay, fine. So from that point on, it was never written down, it wasn't broadcast publicly, but from that point on, I've seen very, very few problems with artists who are going to play at South by Southwest, at an official showcase, or at CMJ, at the official showcase, have problems at the border. So something magical happened there. But what is true is if you're going to play South by Southwest, and you're also going to do a show in St. Louis on the way down, and you've got 3 other shows playing for the Converse All-Stars barbecue, and you're also doing an in-store at Waterloo Records, well, those aren't bona fide industry showcases. And if the officer at the border Googles your name and says, oh, I see you're playing South by Southwest, wait a minute, Converse All-Stars barbecue, Waterloo Records, that's not a showcase. I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you in. So you have to be a little bit careful because, again, as Robert said, the person at the border makes the decision. And if for any reason, or for no reason, they're not convinced by what you're doing, you're not going to get in. So you have to be careful. A lot of artists, even though they don't legally need a visa, they get one just so they don't have to worry about it, which I think is a fairly reasonable thing to do. Does that all make sense? It was really fast, but it's very confusing and it's caused a lot of pain in the last few years and a lot of unnecessary expense. Yeah, Fiona?
You mentioned South by Southwest as a bona fide showcase, but
Yeah.
I'm assuming why APAP, all of these conferences qualify.
You're going to want to do it on a case-by-case basis. APAP, clearly. But Global Fest, which is ostensibly part of APAP, but they sell tickets to the general public, no, you need a visa to do that.
Okay, but you just said the example of South by Southwest would be fine.
Right. And that goes back to what Robert was saying about the person at the border. Anytime you're looking at one of these situations, you have to do 2 analysis. What's legal and what's going to work? If the Canadian Music Export Coalition decides to do a showcase at the Empty Bottle in Chicago on a Tuesday night in November, and you've got a band coming with a van and Marshall stacks and a bunch of guitars, and they're coming across the Peace Bridge border, and they said, no, we're not playing gigs, we're playing a showcase at the Empty Bottle, that officer is going to say, I don't know anything about this, I've never heard of it, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't believe you. Or they might say, I don't believe you, and send you back. Whereas every Customs and Border Protection officer knows about South by Southwest. Anybody on the East Coast knows about CMJ. So if you're playing part of a major event, the chances of the officer believing you are higher than if you're playing some small showcase event. If you are playing a small showcase event, the best thing to do would be to get a letter from, if it's a government entity that's putting on the showcase, or if it's a label, get a letter from them that explains in detail why contractually what you're doing is a private showcase happening at the record label's office. Great. If that's clearly written in a letter, the chances are much greater that the officer is going to look at that and say, oh, you're just playing at the Thrill Jockey office in Chicago. That's fine. I understand why that's acceptable. So if you're playing a huge event that everybody knows exists, like CMJ or South by Southwest, fine. If you have documentation that makes it really clear that what you're doing falls within the showcase exception, you're probably fine.
Things like APAP, it's a member-only conference,
Right.
so it's considered a private event.
Right.
But the letter's always good to have.
Letter's
at the
good.
border.
There was a situation last year for Folk Alliance where a Welsh singer was coming in, and she got stopped because the officer, it was totally a showcase. And Folk Alliance, I think, is a lot like APAP. Almost everybody there is part of the industry. But the officer had never heard of Folk Alliance. She was crossing immigration in Chicago, and Folk Alliance was in Kansas City. The officer had never heard of it, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about, get back on a plane. So if you don't have a visa, you might be legal. Well, if you don't have a visa, you might be legal, and it will probably work if you fall within the rules, but it's always a little bit risky if you don't have a visa. Yes?
And coming back to APAP, what about the situation where, as we know, so many people organize showcases satellite to APAP
Right.
that aren't registered in APAP, but it's...
I would say all of those are risky. It depends on the situation. Like if it's the Swedish Music Export Board that's arranging a showcase at the embassy, and your artist has an invitation from the Swedish embassy to do this APAP showcase, and it's just for people who have APAP badges, even though it's not official. That invitation is probably going to get them into the country. Whereas if they don't have the invitation and they're not on the APAP list, so if the officer Googles the APAP schedule and they're not going to see them there, that could lead to problems. I want to be able to say this is the rule and it's done, but there isn't a rule. There's no specific way that you know for sure.
Sometimes you need to shape the event as well because, I say APAP's a member-only event and the showcases are closed, but they're not really. We know people come in off the street. We know that people invite their friends to come and see it. So, but officially.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you don't have a visa, if you've got documentation, and if the event that you're performing if the event that you're performing at falls within the rules, and you've got documentation to support it, you're probably going to be fine. The other important exception, there's the showcase exception, there's another exception, which is if your artist is coming to perform at an event which is sponsored by, in this case, the Canadian government. If it's entirely sponsored by it, it's a free event, that's fine too. You can do that. In other words, if they're performing at a Canadian consulate or something like that. The other one has to do with recording, which is a little bit confusing. If an artist is coming to the US, a Canadian artist, for example, is coming to the US to record at a US studio, the rule says if at the time of recording they have no intention of licensing or releasing that recording in the US, they can do that without a visa. The only problem is that was written in 1992 when there was no internet. Obviously, any recording now is going to be released anywhere. There is no rule on this now either. If you come into if you're driving your van across the border and you have a letter from the recording studio and your record label saying, yes, we're recording at the studio in Chicago, and we have no intention to release this in the US, you're probably going to be fine. A smart officer might say, who records anything these days that they don't put up on the internet? That's in the US, this doesn't work anymore, but their officers aren't saying that yet. They might.
Yeah, and I've had artists cross on B2s and on that with a business visa they picked up at the border in that situation. So.
Yeah. So the other thing, that just to clarify something for Canadians, because there's an enormous amount of confusion about this, we talk about getting visas, but actually Canadians don't ever get visas to the US. You get a work authorization. You don't have to get a visa. Everybody else in the world has to go to an embassy, get a physical visa put in your passport, which you use to enter the US. Canadians aren't required to have that visa. So when we talk about visas, we're really talking about work authorizations, which is something that the rest of the world has to get in order to get a visa. You guys, you just have to get the work authorization and then get admitted into that classification. Does that make sense? There's also one other thing that's really confusing that causes a lot of tears. There is a little rule about First Nation individuals, which a lot of people misinterpret. The rule says that First Nation artists don't need visas to perform in the US. And they think, oh, that's great. I can just go play. Well, no. It's no different than anybody else. They don't need a visa, but then again, neither do any other Canadian. So it's not really a rule at all. They have to get a work authorization just like everybody else does. I know of First Nation artists who've been touring in the US for years without getting a work authorization because the officers are so confused about this that they get to the border and say, no, I'm First Nation, I don't need a visa. It's like, you're right, I don't need a work authorization. The officer goes, I don't know, okay, fine, go. That's actually not the rule. They need to get a work authorization just like everybody else does.
And Matthew and I are talking about this earlier. He's talking about the Jay Treaty, which allows Native people to cross the border without a visa, but they really can't work. And that's the confusion. Everybody thinks visa is one thing, but visas mean different things. And we were talking about this. That's why Matthew just referred to work authorization. It's a work visa in the United States, and we say you need a visa to cross the border. That's a different document.
Right.
Yeah.
So those are really the hot topics. Most of the phone calls I get from Canadians these days. Just to go over one other quick thing, there are four different types of visas that we see artists using primarily. There's 3 different types of P visas, and there's the O1 visa. The P1 visa is for the member of a internationally renowned musical group. The P2 is a visa that you get through the AFM or the CFM. The P3 is for an artist who is culturally unique. We have in my office what we call the Funny Costumes and Funny Instruments rule, which is making fun of the rather unsophisticated cultural critique that goes on at Homeland Security when they're trying to decide what culturally unique means. Basically, if they look at the person in the picture, in the press picture, it's like, wow, I don't know anybody who dresses like that, and they're playing an instrument I've never seen before. That probably means they can get a P3 visa. Otherwise, you gotta be a little bit careful. You get situations where it's like it's a Foho band from Recife, but they've got a DJ who's scratching. Chances are they're not going to get the P3 because the officers are going to look and say, "A DJ? That's not a folk group. I'm not going to give you the visa." But you never know. So the P3 is a really weird visa that's usually for traditional artists, but you got to be careful with it. And then the O1 is for an individual. Usually a singer-songwriter or a DJ or a classical violinist or anything like that. The other ones are, like, at least arguably, for ensembles or members of ensembles. The P2, because it's handled through the AFM, is often a lot cheaper than trying to work. Well, they're all roughly the same price when you're just thinking about the fees that are paid to the government. But because the P2 is handled by the AFM for their members, they tend to do it very cheaply, which is great. A lot of people get frustrated because the duration with the AFM doesn't tend to last that long. But that's not really because of the law, it's just sort of how it works out with the AFM. Which leads to one last topic, and then I'm going to get off the mic. There has been an enormous amount of confusion in the last couple of years about how long these visas are allowed to last. And the P visas can last for up to a year, the O visas can last for up to 3 years, but you're not going to get a year or you're not going to get 3 years unless you can prove that you have a contractual reason you need to be in the US. It used to be that the way people handled this was the agent would fabricate 200 dates over the course of a year onto an itinerary, and you just submit that with your application, and Homeland Security would say, 200 dates in 1 year, that's a lot of gigs. And they would approve the visa. About a year and a half ago, they started calling clubs to verify if these were true, and of course they weren't. So they started denying the visas where there were these fabricated dates. Not always, but a lot of the time, and it became very scary at that point because people getting denied on grounds of fraud, and nobody wants to be accused of fraud by the US government. So that was bad. But the nice thing is at the same time they started calling clubs, they also issued a memo that said that you no longer need that gaps between dates was no longer a problem. You didn't have to prove that you were performing regularly. So right now the state of affairs is there's 2 ways to get the long-term visa. One is by showing that you've got a date at the beginning of the term of the period of time that you're looking at, and one that's at the end. And as long as you've got those 2 dates covered, maybe a couple things in between, but if you're bookending the duration you're looking for, then it's okay, you've heard all this before. If you're bookending the duration you're looking for, you're probably going to get that full duration. The other way is, and this is fairly new, we're finding that it's possible to get a visa issued based on the contractual relationship the artist has with generally a US agent. If you've got a contract with an agent and that contract lasts for 3 years, if you can use that contract as a way of proving that you have an employment, even though you don't necessarily have your gigs booked yet, that's a way that a lot of artists are getting 3 years or 1 year, depending on what kind of visa they're looking for. I think that's all I've got. I've spoken more than enough.
No, it's great. Yeah, thanks. Any questions at this point?
Work
Yeah.
authorization and work permit are the same thing,
Basically, neither of them
right?
are.
Or not?
No.
Neither of those.
Sorry. Well, it's a terminology game. The work permit in Canada is something else, right? The work permit in Canada is required for certain artists, in certain circumstances. But
In the U.S.,
In the
there
US,
isn't-
no.
there's nothing that's formally called a work permit or a work authorization.
No.
When you get a visa to the U.S., you first apply, you file a petition, I-129, with the U.S. government, and that decides whether you're allowed to get that visa. And when that's approved, they issue something called the I-797 approval notice. And we call that a work authorization because that's effectively what it is. It's saying this person has been authorized to work in the US. A Canadian can just take that to the border and they will be admitted in that status. Everybody else in the world has to go to the embassy and then they'll get a visa, which they'll use to enter the country. That makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just looking for clarification on
Yeah.
this, we use the term work permit.
yeah, right. Only in Canada.
Yeah. Yes.
Just, it's a very personal question.
Then do you want to talk about it afterwards?
Oh,
Sure.
yeah.
Let's do it afterwards. Okay.
Okay, so I'll go on to the other things that affect crossing the border. People always ask me about merchandise and instruments, and so for most people traveling, you can have an inventory of what you're bringing across a border. In Canada, you can get a Y38, which is kind of a green form that you can list everything. I always recommend to artists, take your inventory to your country's border office and get them to stamp it before you come into the other country. So Canadians get Canada to stamp it, come into the United States. And when you come back into Canada, you can show them the list. That's what I took in the United States. That's what I'm bringing back. And the opposite works as well for Americans coming into Canada. Get it stamped in the U.S. before you come into Canada. And then when you're coming back to the States, they won't say, well, what did you pick up in that other country?
But how you will do that if Canadian border, you don't have any way to see them at the exit. You only see them at the entry to Canada. So how you get the paper to the Canadian border, sort of?
They have a little office right before you.
Yeah, they have an office. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, no, you can do that. Yeah. It's a question?
Regarding equipment and merchandise, I'm working with ATA books. You're familiar with ATA books? Delivered by the Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, yeah. The carnet. The carnet,
So
yeah.
isn't that a safer way to do it?
Well, it's recognized internationally as a way of bringing things across the border, yeah. But both work, yeah. The carnet costs between 100 and 300 per year.
Taxes.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But that's a good way to get stuff across. People ask about CDs. There's a regulation that you can bring $2,500 worth without using a customs broker, and that's the cost of manufacture, not the selling cost. And so basically we just, the best thing to do if you cross a lot of borders and you have a lot of CDs, the best thing for me to recommend would be that you get them pressed in the other country. So if you could get your CDs pressed in the United States, then they would be American CDs, so you wouldn't have a problem. But you can either ship them in advance. Sometimes you run into the border problem where they take your CDs and they look at them and they say, well, you're really selling merchandise in this country because you haven't stamped them, to give away, for promotion purposes only. And so they take exception to that. You have to have your CDs marked where they're manufactured, and there are different regulations on carrying CDs across the border. So to avoid that, sometimes it's best just to mail them in advance and have them waiting for you, if you can possibly do that. And many artists take CDs across the border, and depending on the situation at the border, they may not ask you about CDs. I would never volunteer any information. You might have them in the back of your van, and they don't care. They don't see them. They don't ask about them. What are you going to say? Oh, by the way, I've also got 1,000 CDs in the back of my van. You might want to take a look at them. No, so don't do that. And so that basically covers merchandise and CDs crossing the border. The other thing is that when you're performing in another country, there are regulations about withholding. And the withholding is important because it means that you will have money taken off your fee unless you deal with it before you come to your performance. So in Canada, we have what's called an R105 waiver, which you can submit at least 30 days before the gig. Probably 45 would be better. And the Revenue Canada will assess your tax liability. And if they find that you're not going to have any tax liability because it's your fees minus your expenses, what's left over, divided sometimes by the number of people in the group, depending on situations, employees, subcontractors, whatever, you may not be subject to that withholding. But many groups are, especially larger groups and foreign groups, are subject to that, and they have to deal with that. And so I do a lot of waivers for people just because they need to have that done. Then Canada, forward thinking, we used to follow the United States, but I think we're ahead of you on this one.
Clearly.
We now will not allow you to get a waiver if you haven't got your taxation up to date. So you do the waiver, it clearly says we're giving you the waiver, but you must file a tax return. And many people, they will ignore anything from a foreign government because they think it doesn't apply to them. I had a group from, I won't name the country, but they were performing in Toronto with the Toronto Symphony. And Revenue Canada stepped in and garnished a $40,000 fee because they said, we've been sending you letters for like 4 years now and you've ignored every one of them. You haven't done your taxation, so you may owe us money. We'll just take this fee until we find out what we do owe. And any time, withholding is just kind of, it's not taxation. It's like a deposit that they're going to keep till they find out what you owe. That's all it is. So, you know, you may not owe anything, and many people, even if they have withholding, when they file the tax return, they get the money back. It just means they have to wait for it. They have to wait till the next tax year and then file. In the United States, you don't have many options. Unfortunately, you can do a central withholding agreement. You can file an 8233 or a W8BEN or a W8BENE, but more and more venues are not accepting those forms because basically those forms say, I'm from another country and we have a treaty with your country. So for an Canadian American thing, it's $15,000 you can earn tax-free. But how does one venue know what you're earning over a year? So you can claim the tax treaty exemption on an 8233, but they really shouldn't accept it for a performing artist. They shouldn't accept W8BEN the same way. They can accept a W8BENE because that's about company. It's about a company that's been formed without the artists being involved, because IRS would consider if the artist forms a company just as sneaky way of getting, you know, past regulations, but they're actually getting the money directly or indirectly. And but many people don't know this, and that's the other thing. You know, you said earlier what the legal and what works. Many venues will accept an 8233. If they do, more power to them. You get your money. Many venues will accept a W8BEN, fill one out. Some of them ask you for it, fill it out, give it to them. It only goes to them, doesn't go to the IRS, so there's no problem. If they accept that, then you're waived, the withholding is waived. You won't have 30% withheld, you get your full fee. Taxation, I think maybe this is the last thing I'll talk about because I know we're going a little over our regular time, even though we started late. You must file in Canada if you got a waiver, but you should file if you've performed in Canada anyway, because you want to be clear with the authorities that you earn money, even though you pay your taxes in your own country perhaps, or you have to pay in Canada, depending on the tax treaty with your particular country. It's good to have a tax return on file because, you know, at my age I get paranoid and cynical. I'm old and I think, you know what, when I go to the border, that border official scans my passport and you've confirmed for me that the internet is still out there. So they're actually checking the internet, and then I'm thinking, you know what, one day they're just going to know so much about me when I get to that border, they'll say, you didn't file your tax return last year. You know, because they're going to start sharing information. And your kid's not doing too well in grade 6, by the way, you know, I should do something about that. I think, you know, we need to be proactive and say, okay, I'm going to do that. When I perform in the United States, I file a 1040 NR, they're happy, the IRS is happy, nothing's going to come back and bite me in the butt, and now I've completed the cycle, right? My contract was to perform in a foreign country, I dealt with the withholding, I filed my tax return, and now I can come back to that country and perform again, and there won't be any problems with any of that. Yeah.
Question, generally speaking, is the agent, when the agent is collecting the money from the venue and then paying the artist in Canada, is it the agent that does tax return for the agency, or it's always on the artist that has to do the filing and the tax?
Yeah, it's who's working in the country.
But
yeah.
So because the agent is basically paid in Canada, they don't care, they just care about the artist, even though the check is made to the agency.
Are you talking about somebody performing in the U.S.?
Right. Let's say you have a Canadian artist performing in the U.S., the agency collects the money, the check is made to the agency, but all this filing is all about the artist, never about the agency.
They don't care who the money is paid to. As far as they're concerned, you can set up as many different channels for the money to go through before it gets to the artist, or have people taking their pieces. But what they're looking at is labor was performed, money was paid for that labor. How much money was paid for that labor? It doesn't matter if it was actually paid to the artist or not.
The tax issue is about the persons. Really.
Right. It's about the individuals,
Yeah.
which is why he was saying what Robert was saying. If you've got a band that has 60 people in the band, you're going to divide up that guarantee among 60 people. That determines how many.
But they won't care about the tax of the agent that also has a percentage of that.
If the venue pays the agent, as far as the U.S. tax authority is concerned, that might as well have gone to the artist.
But even the agency gets like a percentage of the fee, and that the artist just get like
Right. What the government's going to look at is say the venue, the guarantee is $1,000, and usually the contract is between the venue and the artist. It's created by the agent, but it's usually a contractual relationship between the venue and the artist. What? In the U.S. it usually is, but maybe not.
Yeah.
But what they're going to look at is they're going to say, okay, so the artist was paid $1,000 for this gig. Okay, so one of the expenses of the gig was gas, guitar strings, 15% that went to the agent. That's where they're going to, whatever percentage is getting paid to the agent comes out of that. Even if the check is paid to the agent, they're still going to say it was $1,000 that the artist earned. And the agent's fee is going to be seen as an expense against their profit. Does that make sense?
If the contract is made to the artist, that makes sense.
Right.
To Jean-François' point, if the contract is made to the agency,
It makes less sense, but it still works the same way.
it's still looking at the artist.
Yeah. Because the artist was performing the labor.
So does the agency pay the tax?
No,
Or
the agent,
file? Does the agency file or does the artist file?
the artist files.
Usually it depends. Usually the agency doesn't have to file because under the treaties between the countries, if you do not have a permanent establishment in the other country and you're not actually performing, then you're exempted from the whole thing because you're a separate entity completely.
You're a
So
pass-through.
yeah, exactly. You're a pass-through. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
Just to know, I think also in the calculation of the money that's being made in the US, even if you get, for Canadian artists, if you have grants that was used to perform those gigs, they count it in the amount, I've been told that, yeah.
That's possible.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, yeah. If you get a grant,
All the money that
yeah.
you generated by
Yeah, yeah.
the fact that you were working in the US and count that in the $50,000 max a year that you could.
yeah, exactly. And you know, unfortunately, if you go like $1 over, you're taxable for the whole amount. But they will count any kind of support you get. But usually, as Matthew said, they'll allow you all the deductions. They basically want to know what your net is. What is your net earning? And if that, you know, for countries not like the United States, where it's very generous, or the UK, other countries, it's usually a $5,000 limit. And if you earn above that, then there's a problem. But if you earn below that, it's usually not an issue. And depending on the structure of your group, you know, if you have, I've done work, say, for International Guitar Night, where there are 4 people coming in. They divide the fees, they divide the net by the 4 people. So everybody earns, you know, $1,250 in the end, and that's below our limit for tax. So
I have one more thing to hawk here. I'm on the board of a nonprofit called Thomasdot, which this last year got a grant from, which almost never happens, we got a grant from the U.S. National Foundation for the Arts to start a project which we call Thomasdot Avail. Avail stands for Artist Visa Assistance and Information Line. It's a hotline, an email address that if you're having problems with U.S. immigration and you're an artist, you can contact this service, and it's volunteer lawyers who can help you figure out what's gone wrong. There's limitations on what we can help with legally, but basically it's an ear to turn to you know, get a hand if something's gone wrong. Like anything from you filed a petition and it's got a request for evidence and you don't understand it, to you're at the border and they're letting everybody through except for the drummer and you don't know why. It's a hotline to call to get assistance with that. The other thing we're doing with that is we're collecting information about where there are problems in the system and doing an analysis of those. We're working in conjunction with the Immigration Law Department at New York Law School, so we have law students who are gathering information from all around the world, problems that artists are having, analyzing it, and then reporting that back to the State Department to say, like, you know, there's a rogue officer in the consulate in Berlin and somebody needs to deal with the fact that he's not adjudicating properly, this kind of thing. So if you are working with artists who are going into the US and you need help, take one of these, because this has the contact information. Or if you don't need help but you want to complain about something, tell us about that as well, because we want to hear your complaints so we can figure out, is it somebody have a bad day or is it a systemic problem that needs to be addressed?
yeah, this is great because we do need advocacy in this area. And I say, I'll throw my oar in too, because when I started being a consultant in this area, I said to everybody, my advice is free. I have an 800 number, call me or email me. I'll tell you exactly what I know. I'm happy to share all my knowledge with you. The only time money comes into this equation is if you ask me to do some work for you. Then I'll quote on what it will cost you and you can decide. But you can, there's information out there on the internet. You can have the learning curve yourself. And, you know, there are a lot of things to learn about and to figure out for yourself. And if you have the time, more power to you. If you need help, give us a call. This is great. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Thank you, Matthew. I think we're done. Thanks, Eli.